Well, hello and welcome back to another episode of TIO Talks. My guest today is Peter Chang. Peter is a scholar based in Malaysia. He's been on the show before and brings a wealth of experience and knowledge in relation to all matters Asian, ASEAN, and regional geopolitics. Welcome back, Peter.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you again. The reason why I wanted to get you back on the show is that recently you wrote a couple of pieces close together around, I guess, a series of themes related to the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and the end of uh, the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist wars in Asia, particularly Japanese fascism and imperialism. And what I wanted to do first and foremost was perhaps pick your brains a little bit on what that experience is from an Asian perspective in terms of 80 years after the end of the war in the Pacific and the end of the struggles against Japanese imperialism. And why does it matter today?
Warwick, thank you for giving me this opportunity to bring, and you accentuate that emphasis, the Asian experience, the Asian dimension. I think there is almost a felt that there's a lack of this dimension over the last 80 years in the mainstream narrative of World War II. Who the victors are, we know who the villains are, and we know who the victors are. But we're beginning to feel that there is a much bigger group who see themselves as also part of the victory group. The September the 3rd parade in Beijing is China's own effort to bring that narrative up to the front. It just felt that the Second World War mainstream narrative has been so Western dominated that it needs to have a more holistic dimension to it. And China is certainly doing its part with the parade. And China has invited us in Southeast Asia, ASEAN. Some of us countries will be represented at the parade to give a more holistic Asian dimension. For us here in Southeast Asia, we experience the horrors of World War II as well. And it's not much recorded. Much of the battlefields that has been focused on was on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that we hear a lot, of course, on mainland Asia, China itself, but Southeast Asia also suffered a brunt of the Japanese conquest and brutality. So I think it's absolutely important for us. Of course, for those of us here in Southeast Asia, we are familiar with with the history, the very painful and difficult history, but we just felt that the rest of the world may not really fully have heard our own experience. And this is one opportunity in which we can bring that out and to let the rest of the world to know, get a better, fuller picture of the World War II history from the Asian dimension, from China dimension, and now from the Southeast Asian dimension as well.
In terms of the Southeast Asian experience, Malaysia, where you are, of course, had some very specific episodes of brutality, targeting in particular the Chinese Malay community, but not only that community. Could you perhaps fill us in a little bit on some of that historical background? Because I think, as you outlined in your opening remarks, remarkably little is known about the experiences of Asia in the Second World War beyond a couple of keynote events. And I think that this is an opportunity for people to fill in some blanks, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. Malaysia at the time was Malaya and Singapore was under British colonial rule, and but the Japanese came in very quickly down south, uh, conquered it overnight almost, and they were here. They saw rule over Malaya and Singapore from 1941 to 1945. Um, the British saw roll back into Singapore and wasn't able to withstand the sudden Japanese invasion. So they pretty much folded up. But after the Japanese began their occupation, there were resistance. guerrilla resistance groups that formed mainly in the jungles and the rural areas to fight, to resist, and to cause to try to uh, gain some upper hand in terms of the Japanese occupation. And most of these resistant fighters were ethnic Chinese, and there were some Malays, and there were some Indians as well. And so when they began to resist, the Japanese saw this as an extension of their war with China, because the majority of these resistant fighters were ethnic Chinese. So the ethnic Chinese community, both in Singapore and Malaya, became a target of the Japanese rule. There were severe collective punishment on the Chinese community as a whole in Malaya. They were rounded up, faced brutal sort of horror, uh, public executions, and things like that. So there were cases of massacre as well. So for over 5 years, it was pretty, uh, it was kind of more like a guerrilla warfare than a full-scale warfare, but there was certainly a resistance against the Japanese occupation in Malaya.
The how many people are known to have been killed during that period of resistance, Peter?
One of the massacre incidents, it went up to as high as about 100,000, both in Singapore and Malaya. I do not have the exact figure, but I think it's about in that region, perhaps even more. Uh, but the historical memory that sears into the memory of those who survived the Second World War under Japanese occupation was horrific. For generations, it took them many years and generations to recover. We still have living memories, people who have survived that atrocity and still bearing the scars of their brutality. The A lot of them were rounded up as prisoners of war or forced labor to build the horrific railway that links Burma and Thailand, that cost over 100,000 lives, I think, if I'm not wrong. That is also another horrific tragedy for the modern Southeast Asian history.
Yeah, look, it seems that in many regards the sort of brutality that took place across many of the countries of Southeast Asia almost got lost as the post-war narrative became dominated by the Hollywood stories, in a sense. Firstly, of course, of the two nuclear bombs that were dropped by the Americans on Japan, and then, of course, a couple of keynote moments that largely involved the US in the war, such as Pearl Harbor, and things like that.
Mhm.
But so much of this Southeast Asian experience seems to have been largely neglected in the broader narrative. Uh, as we celebrate or commemorate, I should say, this 80th anniversary of the end of the war, aside from the events in Beijing itself, uh, are there other activities across the region and in Malaysia itself that will seek to, in a sense, bring public memories back together around these events in a way to learn from the historical experience and continue a dialogue about, especially in the current moment globally where there's so much tension and conflict, to think about how it is that Asian nations can work towards avoiding this happening again.
Warwick, yeah, the Beijing Victory Parade has received quite a lot of coverage over here, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, at the regional level, we don't have any comparable 80th anniversary commemoration right now. But I hope that the Beijing event could stimulate, or could could be sort of a stepping stone towards our own regional sort of effort to have our own kind of a commemoration and recollection of the World War II, so that we could also learn the lessons from it and then look forward towards the future, how we could better prepare ourselves for that kind of horrific experience. So I think it's good that uh, Beijing and China is doing it. The rest of ASEAN and Southeast Asia are watching it, and there will be certainly valuable lessons that we could get from the Beijing own experience, and also that we could learn from that experience as well.
The Beijing commemorations, of course, have a broader umbrella in a sense, as you touched on. They have sought to ensure that it encompasses not just China's own direct experience, but also the broader Asian experience as a collective struggle against Japanese fascism. So perhaps as you say, that there will be a catalyst for further local reflections as well. One of the interesting things, of course, in commemorating the end of wars is that it does provoke a lot of emotional reactions for people in different kinds of ways, sometimes very reflective. And at other times, of course, it can provoke strong senses of nationalism and even worse, all sorts of resentments and hatreds. One of the interesting things I found in the Chinese discussions about this is an emphasis on remembering history so as not to sustain the hatreds that led to warfare in the past. And I guess what I wanted to, gauge from your own perspective is how it is that Asian communities in Southeast Asia, in a sense, through the trauma of the post-war experience, have, in a sense, tried to put that experience behind it and focus on building, in a sense, a new Asia, but an Asia that draws on its own rich, multipolar experiences itself.
Good point, Warwick. Yeah, the best way to really learn to heal ourselves is the ability to forgive and to move on. And I think in many ways, Southeast Asia has moved on. Japan became a very, very key, vital um, partner for ASEAN, for Southeast Asia in terms of economic development. They have been so critical in the 70s and 80s and 90s in helping us to develop to where we are today. So at that level, Southeast Asia has moved past uh, the World War II trauma in terms of accepting and recognizing Japan as at least at the national level, at the economic level, a change partner, somebody that now who was once our conqueror, is now a very constructive partner in helping Southeast Asia and ASEAN to build to where we are today. So that's critical, I think, moving forward as to the ability to 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 remember the past, but not let the past hold us back for moving forward in a constructive way. Having said that, there is growing concern that within segments of the Japanese community or elite that seems to have difficulty coming to terms with some of the horrific atrocity that they have committed uh, under the name of their own sort of imperial sort of goals and aspirations. Even today, some aspects of the right wing or far right wing parts of the political elite still have not seemed to be able to come to terms with their own difficult history. And for that reason, I think it's important for us to know, as much as we want to not forget, forgive, and move on, but we also want to remind those who have forgotten about the atrocity that has been done in their name. And it's important for us to do that. Of course, we want to forgive and move forward, but we also have to make sure that the lesson has been learned, painful lessons has been learned by all those parties who were responsible for it. And that's why a commemoration like this is a very important and critical sort of moment of historical lessons.
I noticed that recently in China, two films have been released that really go to the heart of this. One which is depicting the massacre in Nanjing, and the other one is the Project 731, which was the Japanese um, laboratory that was operated in northeast China. And both of those movies have really provoked, I think, an incredible reaction globally. It's also, in the context of your remarks, provoked some reactions in the Japanese political culture as well, which is some efforts to deny and some efforts to reject this version of history. And it seems to me that perhaps there is still some work to be done uh, in Japan to perhaps emulate the kind of work that Germany went through in the years after the war to essentially come to terms with its own recent history so that it could in a sense forgive itself and move on. Do you think that there's a role for the countries of the region to also play in this process to assist Japan to come to terms with this? And if countries around the region can bring themselves to forgive, even if not to forget, then perhaps it's time for Japan to forgive itself as well by coming to terms with its own atrocities.
Yeah, I think we're ASEAN and Southeast Asia has done a remarkable job in embracing Japan after World War II. In as what I've said earlier, as seeing Japan as such an important partner. Uh, of course, we have our emotions are raw as well. Some of us still have very strong feelings about how painful the Second World War has been. Uh, I think we may have slightly a little bit more geographical distance, and I don't want to diminish the pain that we have had in Southeast Asia, but I think maybe China and Korea may have the pain has been even deeper for them because of the distance, geographical, and also the experience that we had. Southeast Asia has a little bit more room in terms of accepting Japan for what it is. But we can play a role, I think, in mediating and trying to bring Japan to the point to tell them that that World War II history was a difficult one. It was a difficult one for you all. It was a difficult one for us as well. Uh, but you got to understand that some part of the Asian community have not felt that you have really repented or really uh, taken up uh, the responsibility as the Germans have had. So, yeah, it's a long process. I mean, this is a process that is not just historical; it's also contextual, modern. It is also at the moment how the national identity, the Japanese national collective self identity reflects the moment itself. If they feel somewhat more confident, then they might be able to reach that point of really accepting where their own guilt has been. But if they are felt that they themselves are feeling threatened or on the back foot, then it might be a little bit more difficult. But I can tell you in Southeast Asia, although we had difficult experience during World War II, there's a lot of room, uh, uh, goodwill for Japan in other ways, you know. So I think if there is a place that we could play, I think we Southeast Asians, ASEAN as a whole, uh, may be a good mediating partner in terms of helping Japan to come to that point of taking some responsibility for World War II. But the emotions between Korea, South Korea in particular, Korea and China with Japan is very, very deep and very raw. So I think for the other two countries to ask the Japan to reach where we think they should will be a little bit more difficult. But people, other parts of Asia could play a more mediating role, I think.
Look, of course, the depth of the emotional trauma will play out differently, I guess, across different places. But one of the challenges that we have is, aside from recognizing the differences in the experiences, is nonetheless to think through how to create the institutions and the, shall we say, the regional operating system, the cultural systems, the behavioral norms, and the attitudes that exist towards each other that perhaps can bring or contribute towards the ongoing processes of closure. And I'm thinking here in particular, Peter, about um, ASEAN's operating ethos, which is really around inclusiveness and consensus as a way of addressing issues. And I also wanted to draw on a couple of post war experiences in Europe to, I guess, illustrate a point that I'll hopefully get to quickly. And that is, after the Second World War in Europe, and then we had the blocks form. So we had the Warsaw Pact and NATO emerge. In 1975, the Helsinki Accord was signed off, and the aim of that was to actually develop an inclusive security architecture. Now, that went nowhere. And then in 1991, after the end of the Soviet Union, there was a similar opportunity to develop an inclusive security architecture that included Russia within the broader European security environment. Asia didn't really have a security architecture in that kind of way, in part because efforts to create an Asian NATO back then failed, but in part also because the American dominance in the area, particularly its ability to establish a military presence in Japan, Korea, and the Philippines, in a sense, made that kind of regional indivisible security architecture impossible at that time. But perhaps it's time again that we revisited those ideas and drew on the the neutrality and the non-aligned ethos of Bandung, and also the actual history of ASEAN, which is underrated and underappreciated as a cornerstone to articulating a 21st century version of an indivisible, inclusive security architecture in Asia. Do you think that that's something that the shared experiences of the Second World War can perhaps contribute towards that kind of thinking?
Warwick, I'm not exactly sure we would have anything close to a NATO in this part of the world. Um, Let me just respond in this way. The Bandung conference is critical, the non-alignment thing. So neutrality, we're inclusive, open to all. We do not want to take sides. And ASEAN itself has this treaty of amity and cooperation, which is basically between the ASEAN members itself that we have this commitment, pledge commitment that if there's any disputes between us, it should be resolved peacefully, diplomatically. Um, I'm not exactly sure there will be a regional wide as Asia or East Asia sort of military architecture. China itself doesn't really see itself as a military sort of umbrella thing. The trilateral initiative, global development initiative, global security initiative, global civilizational initiative, it doesn't see any sort of military architecture as a standalone structure to provide security. It sees it holistically. It has to be done in conjunction with other dimensions of our human existence, our cultural, our economic, our civilizational, our geopolitical, rather than a standalone military architecture. So I think I'm, I'm not an expert on this, but my own sort of the worldview here is so different. We don't see military is not front and center in our worldview. We see we see ourselves as a civilization, and relationships between nation states should be based uh, along those holistic what it means to be a civilizational country. So in all its various dimension. Now, let me give you, you gave some experiences of conflicts in Europe. We have one difficult conflict right now in Southeast Asia, which is the Thailand and Cambodia border clashes. Is horrific. It happened so suddenly. I mean, the border dispute has been for the longest time. It's almost a century, or it goes back to the colonial period. But for
Yeah,
some reason,
the
it's
French
been
didn't help,
on and
did
off
they?
and off.
The French didn't help,
Sorry?
did they? The French didn't help very much when they
No.
drew an arbitrary line.
Yes. Yeah, we can. Okay, the colonial mass powers have something to be responsible for, but this is also a very human problem, and we mustn't just push everything to our colonial past. We have some responsibility for ourselves as well. Where we have disputes like that, we got to find a way to solve it. We can only blame our past up to a certain point, but today we have to face it squarely. How should we solve it? And yeah, we have not. I don't think we have it's a bit like the South China Sea disputes as well, the territorial disputes. There is no legal means in which, or even historical, to clearly that would satisfy all the competing parties. So ASEAN and Asia, in some ways, we talk a lot about the Asian way. And one thing about the Asian way is that we are not only tolerance of diverse views or very inclusive, we accommodate diversity. But I think there's one thing about the Asian way is that we learn to live with unresolved disputes. And I think it's a sign of resilience and also maturity of a particular block or system. If we can still able to coexist and operate despite the fact we have problems that we cannot resolve, you know. Uh, so I think it's critical for us moving forward, ASEAN right now with the Cambodia and Thailand border crisis. The ceasefire has temporarily put a stop on the hostility, but the border dispute is apparently cannot be resolved anytime soon. Both sides have to come to an understanding that we probably have to live with that pain.
Well, it's fascinating,
Then
right, Peter? This idea of actually being able to um, live with the unresolved disputes and understand that they're not going to be resolved quickly and easily, but you can't at the same time let that reality get in the road of everything else. And there's something, in a sense, quite forgiving in that, in and of itself,
yes,
because we're accepting that that there aren't easy black and white, right and wrongs in any of this, and perhaps we try and do two things. We, meaning us here in Asia. Firstly, it's to minimise the extent that these disputes, even though they exist, lead to bloodshed. That's the first one. And secondly, recognise that perhaps the conditions aren't right for a solution to emerge, and we just have to let time roll out a little bit more, and maybe sometime in the future the conditions will emerge where the parties can find the common ground and solve that particular problem. Um, Now we're going to be coming into the Bandung celebrations. I think next year, isn't it? For the big one, is it next year?
Or it was in April.
It was
They have
April
their
this
yeah,
year.
yeah. They just passed. It was very low key. Yeah,
I've
it
gotten
has.
this year wrong on two occasions with you. I know this, and for some reason, um, I'm either ahead of myself or I'm behind, right? But I never seem to be quite on the time. It was a low key thing, which probably explains why it wasn't top of mind. But nonetheless, I think the Bandung spirit, if you will, needs to find a way of again gaining some voice. And I'm wondering, as really my last question for you is again whether the and going back to this 80th uh, anniversary of the end of the war, after which, of course, Bandung conference took place. What do you see, I guess, as the principal challenges and opportunities over, say, the next 5 to 10 years in the Asian part of the world to leverage all of these cultural and historical legacy assets that we have in this region to try to ensure that the wars and conflicts that are currently affecting other parts of the world uh, don't end up affecting this part of the world, and perhaps through the way that Asia can manage that, uh, help other parts of the world think about alternative methods to addressing disputes.
Uh, Good question, Warwick. But I'll just take a ASEAN way of um, answer to this. And one way is we always been accused as being a talk shop. We talk a lot and do nothing. But I can tell you, talking helps. ASEAN has got so many different meetings. We have the summit at the head of states level, and then the foreign ministers, the trade ministers, the education ministers. They are meeting all the time. ASEAN members are constantly engaged with one another. We are meeting one another all the time. And there is no better place right now, I think, than to iron out or to sort of clear up any sort of misunderstandings or dissonances than meeting face to face. And there's a lot of questions about what is this ASEAN way. The ASEAN way is really, even though we do not agree with our neighbors on certain things, we will always take an effort to want to keep the communication channel open, constantly engage with one another. And the Cambodia Thailand case is a very good scenario, case study in some ways. Malaysia under Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's leadership really took a lot of effort, background, a sort of in the backdoor sort of negotiation and engaging with all the parties involved. We have this sense that we are like a family, a community. We dispute, we quarrel with one another, but we meet the head of states of the ASEAN prime ministers and presidents meets at least twice a year. They are almost like a family, brothers and sisters. Although at the state level, country level, there may be some differences, but when the leaders meet together, there's a lot of hugging and shaking of hands, camaraderie. So that kind of ASEAN sort of spirit that holds us together, that sort of friendliness or sort of very informal sort of collegiality is critical. Let me just put it this way, Warwick. As we move forward, there will be a lot of geopolitical shifts and changes, great power rivalries, and others. But if there is an ASEAN uh, contribution to how to mitigate this, I would just say that we have to continue talking to one another. Even though we have differences, we have disputes, we got to keep the channels open. Thailand and Cambodia, the leaders are still communicating with one another, and it's critical. And then the rest of the family, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, are encouraging them to come together, to come to the table and continue to talk to one another. Don't stop talking. It is through talking that we will be able to at least minimize risk, but at best can help heal the wound. So moving forward, I would say the ASEAN way is to keep the communication channels open.
Look, that's a hugely important lesson, actually, Peter, and I thank you for sharing that with
Mm,
us because, whilst, as you say, the talking is often criticized because it's not seen as doing, in the world of peacemaking and
mm,
conflict resolution, talking is actually the most important part of doing. Um, Look, I could go on for a lot more, but I know that your time's precious. And in fact, we could talk for a long time about this. But look, Peter, could I just thank you again for coming on the show, sharing with
Thank
us
you.
your reflections on the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of the war against fascism in Asia and the World War II, and
Mhm.
importantly, sharing with us ways in which people in Southeast Asia are bringing the diplomatic card to the table as part of a constructive effort to not only ensure peace within this region, but to also show how peace could be constructed and developed across the world. So, once again, thank you for coming on the show, Peter.
Thank you, Warwick. It's an honor. Thank you very much.
If you like that video, please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.